Welcome to the Vibrantly You podcast. We're your hosts, Megan Martineau
and Caitlin Cipriano. In this podcast, we talk about fitness and nutrition on your motherhood journey. Whether you are trying to conceive, pregnant, postpartum, or beyond, you are welcome here.
Nothing is off limits, and our goal is to support you in this important season of life so that you can feel vibrantly you. As a reminder, this information is not medical advice. Please see the show notes for more details. Welcome back to the Vibrantly You podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about the connection between thyroid and fertility. So, in this episode, we're going to be running through some nutrition and lifestyle guidelines to help promote optimal thyroid functioning, as well as running through a real life case study. So, Caitlin, how do you want to kick this episode off? Should we just talk about thyroid hormones, what those are, just to orient people with this?
Yeah, so let's just go through how thyroid hormones impact fertility, and then we can move into kind of your case study and what that all looks like and where we can implement these nutritional and lifestyle guidance tips. So, with the thyroid hormones, T3 and T4 in particular, regulate metabolism, but they also signal to the reproductive system. So they are influencing ovulation, menstrual cycle regularity, as well as the uterine environment. And when it comes to fertility, both hypothyroidism as well as hyperthyroidism. So hypo is underactive thyroid and hyper is overactive thyroid, and they can both be disruptive of optimal fertility status. And not only are they involved in the act of helping with conception, but also with keeping the pregnancy too. So, both hypo and hyperthyroidism can increase the risk of miscarriage if it is left untreated. So I thought I'd mention that today because I don't know about you, but I actually see this a lot online and people, being like, why have I had so many pregnancy losses? Like they can get pregnant, but they can't keep the pregnancy. And a lot of them I would, puzzle piece together, like relate to this thyroid because a lot of times I think even when we talk about your case can kind of go unnoticed because you can be in a, quote unquote normal range when you're getting lab work done, but it may not be the optimal range for pregnancy, for fertility ranges.
Yeah, something I find so interesting about this is we know that the thyroid's so important, right, for both conceiving and maintaining a pregnancy, and yet it's not something that's regularly tested during this like time frame.
No, right? You have to really like advocate for getting this lab work done. It's not something that is just like standard practice. And so I always do encourage, clients, particularly if, they are trying to conceive and maybe having some difficulty, that they get this full panel for TSH, T4, free T3, the thyroid antibodies, and sometimes the reverse T3 too. And really making sure again that they're in optimal ranges. So if, for example, I'm not going to go through all of those, but we'll use the TSH, because this one is fairly important here. So when you're trying to conceive, you want that range to be between 1 to 2.5, which is lower than what the normal population range is when you get that blood work done.
Yeah, which again, I find so interesting because this is not something that most people are aware of. Yeah, it's something that like doctors don't really bring up. And yeah, like the normal range, I think, for TSH goes up to like 4 or 5,
Yeah.
which is obviously very different than 1 to 2.5.
Yeah, it's very like significant of a difference. I was just trying to pull up what the normal ranges fall between outside of pregnancy, but I think it's 4. Yeah, so it goes up to 4. So the and this is for females. Yeah, the normal upper end of normal range can be that 2.5 up to 4. And then if you go beyond the 4, then that's the underactive thyroid. And overactive is actually less than about point 0.5.
And
So
so with fertility and even pregnancy, what is more typical, being hypothyroid or hyper?
it can be either as far as that like impact and being disruptive. I feel like what I have tended to see more of personally, those numbers being higher, but certainly again, when we're talking about the fertility piece, either way can be impacted. And while the lifestyle guidance might be somewhat different for each of those, our like foundational pieces are going to be fairly similar. And when you do find out that, again, you suspect that this might be the case, you've gone to get blood work done that is confirming, you know, being on medication is going to, in most people's case, be very assistive towards the lifestyle and nutrition changes that you're doing on top of that.
Yeah. So do we want to go ahead and talk about some of the nutrition and lifestyle factors?
Yeah, yeah. So I think that when you're talking about fertility, right, our biggest foundational piece is going to be starting off with our PHFF concept here, right? Like this is the starting point for most clients that's going to make the most impact and sense. So this is going to help with balancing your blood sugar. It is going to help with just like your overall satiety in general, as well as your energy, your mood levels, and just keeping, your hormones like happy so that they're like fluctuating in the ranges that they're supposed to be fluctuating in. So PHFF stands for protein, healthy fats, and fiber, and we're going to pair those with our carbohydrates. So those little concepts, they're best friends. We want to use them so that, again, like you can really feel your best when you're doing that. Um, and then once you have like got that like nice solid foundation down, we're gonna want to move into some more like, you know, more, I don't want to say like detailed, but more like intention around like specific micronutrients. So we talked about the protein and just like, again, overall adequate amount of calories because, if you are someone that maybe is coming from a place where you've been on a lot of like diets, in your life, maybe before thinking about moving into this like fertility time frame, those can really like impact and suppress the thyroid. So again, that's why I talk about the PHFF as that foundation piece. And then we move into focusing on, things like iodine and selenium, which are essential for the thyroid hormone production and conversion. Um, and then also things like iron, zinc, vitamin D, B12. These are, if those levels are like low or in a deficiency place, can actually worsen like the thyroid dysfunction that's going on. So those are very like targeted micronutrients that we would then also look at again, we're basing this off of like blood work, like we're collaborating, with your provider on this part too.
Yeah. And there's so much that goes into it. And again, I just feel like there's not enough awareness about like thyroid and thyroid function and how much it impacts your body overall, but especially for fertility and pregnancy. It's so crazy to me that it's just not something that's really talked about unless you're like having an issue and then you're aware of this and you bring it up to a doctor.
Yeah, and I think, if we think about like your case with this, right? When you were trying to conceive with your daughter, is like, you're doing all those like foundational pieces, right? And you're like, why why is this not like happening? And so it almost is like putting together like puzzle pieces and being like, oh, okay, I think that we should look into this, which is for, I think, a lot of people just so frustrating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I can talk about just how I discovered that the thyroid was maybe the missing piece. So, I was tracking my cycles on paper. Like I was paper tracking. So, I wasn't using an app. And so, what I mean by this is I was tracking my basal body temperature. I was tracking cervical mucus to like try to pinpoint when I was ovulating. And I mean, both you and Brandy. So Brandy is a FAMS educator. We interviewed her earlier this year on the podcast. Her episode is episode number 21, where we talk all about the FAM method with trying to conceive. And both of you noticed on my charts that my temperatures, I think it was in the follicular phase, were low. They were like below 96.
Hmm.
And you were both like, that can indicate a thyroid issue. You might want to talk to your doctor. And I was like, what? Okay. And I would have never known, right? I would have just been like, oh, I'm just someone maybe who trends, a lower temperature. Because, that whole like 98.6 or whatever, that's like average, right? So most people are not always, you know, the same temperature all the time. So I was just like, oh, okay. So I went to my primary care doctor and I don't remember what it was that I like told her, but I was just like, I would like to get my thyroid checked. Like, I feel like maybe it's a little off. And she was like, oh, okay. Super easy, right? Just did a blood test. And then I get a message from her in my chart, and she was like, I am so glad that you thought to check this because your thyroid, I think it was 3.98, my TSH. I don't remember what the other numbers were, but she was like, you will not conceive with this number. And then she told me the same thing, like you want it to be between 1 and 2.5. And she was like, this, while it's still normal, this falls significantly out of range and you will not conceive. And that was my primary care too. That wasn't even an OB/GYN. So she told me to reach out to the OB and just like let them know that they would um manage the medication. And so that was what I did. I reached out to my OB because I was already connected with one from my previous birth. Um, and they were like, yep, you're not going to conceive with those numbers. They pretty much agreed with my primary care and they got me on medication right away. And I started on a lower dose. So it was 50 micrograms, right? MCG
Yeah.
micrograms. Um, and then I think after 4 weeks, we retested just to see where my levels were. And eventually, I can't remember if it was like 4 weeks or 8 weeks, but they did come back down into that optimal range. And it was only 2 or 3 cycles after being put on that medication that I successfully conceived. And then when I was pregnant, they were like, okay, we need to be checking this, frequently. I do have a history of miscarriage. I had a first trimester miscarriage with my very first pregnancy. So they were also wanting to monitor because of that. So I don't think it was right when I found out I was pregnant that they tested my thyroid, maybe, but definitely at my first appointment and pretty much every appointment I went to, because in the beginning of your pregnancy, you go like what, once a month, every 4 weeks or
Yeah.
so. So every time I went, they were testing my thyroid. And then it was in March, I remember. So my baby was born in July. So I don't know, I would have been 5 months pregnant, maybe in March. My TSH did start to creep up. I don't think it went out of that optimal range, but I think it was closer to 2.5. And they were like, this makes us a little uncomfortable. Let's increase your dosage to make sure we're like lower in that optimal range. So I did have to increase my dosage to 75 micrograms for the rest of my pregnancy. And then as we continued testing it, everything stayed where it needed to be on that higher dosage. And then ultimately, after I gave birth, I think it was my 6 week postpartum appointment. Again, they tested my thyroid again because with all those hormone fluctuations postpartum, they wanted to see where it was at. And then I started trending almost in the hyperthyroidism,
Mm.
where my levels were like below, I think it was like zero point 0.6. So then I was like below one. And they were like, we can reduce the dosage now. So then I reduced it and went to just the 50 again. Um, and I think it was that 1 year postpartum, I ended up coming off of the medication because they were like, you don't need to stay on this if you don't want to. And just because I was like, I think they called it like subclinical hypothyroidism.
Right.
They were like, it's up to you if you want to be on this or not. So I did decide to come off of it. But interestingly, I recently got my thyroid levels tested just at a regular, doctor's appointment. And it is back up in the 3 range, which is
Mhm.
interesting. So it's like lower threes. So it's something, we just continue to monitor. But if it continues to like creep up and then come out of that normal range for conceiving or
Yeah.
pregnancy, I would have to go back on the medication. So it is very interesting the way that those levels can just fluctuate so much.
Yeah, and I think there's we hadn't talked about just some other like lifestyle guidance, and I think you know there is still a lot of change in those hormones, especially in the first like 1 to 2 years postpartum that are dependent too on if you're breastfeeding and those types of changes. But like stress management and sleep all are things that are going to impact your thyroid too. And just, if you we're not don't have to like deep dive into like everything that's going on postpartum, but it is a time where like sleep is less, it can be stressful depending on what your situation is. And so, while of course we don't ever expect anyone to be perfect with these things, it's just a good like reminder that like taking care of your central nervous system is really important and impactful. So, making sure that like you're trying to do the best you can with your sleep and like making it a priority. I know it's not it's not easy. Um, but you know, taking time to like take 10 minutes to journal or meditate or whatever, form of self-care feels good for you.
Yeah, and I know I didn't say this because I was mostly just talking about the medication, but even throughout my pregnancy, like we were working together too on my nutrition to make sure I was hitting all those key points that you talked about too,
Yeah.
making sure I was really on a high quality prenatal vitamin that was also checking all of those boxes. So I do think it's important to not just rely on the medication, right? To be like, oh, I'm medicated, like I'm good. I don't have to think about these things anymore. Like you said, like taking care of your central nervous system, sleep, all that stuff. Like it's still important to pay attention to all those things, even if you are on medication, because they all work together.
Yeah, exactly. Like we can't just rely on medications or supplements alone to do the job. Like we have to take intentionality to like be supportive so that those things really work and have the most impact that they can have. So, think about it as like, supplements and medication are like assistive, like they're going to help you like achieve the goal, but you also need to like put that mindfulness and work in around, the nutrition and again, like you said, like stress management and make sure you're sleeping and all those good things. They really do matter and make a difference.
Yeah, and another cool thing I wanted to just circle back around to. So, my first clue, right, was tracking my cycle and seeing those lower
Yeah.
temperatures. And so, once I was on the medication and my thyroid was coming more into normal range, I did notice an increase, like ever so slightly, right? Like it's so small, but in that follicular phase, in and even in my luteal phase, I did
Hmm.
notice those temperatures just slightly increased, like overall. So I found that very fascinating.
Yeah, it was really, it's like again a really good example of like, okay, like we found the missing piece, we identified it, like you got the lab work, we had the action plan with like the nutrition and the supplements and everything. And again, you were able to like see, okay, like there's a difference, like, and you conceived too. So it was like, again, such a good example of being able to like identify, put into action and see like, okay, positive and results. So, which doesn't always happen, obviously,
Yeah.
but like it is just, again, I think good awareness for people to have, like you said, this isn't something that's like talked about regularly or brought up at maybe OBGYN appointments if you're having difficulty with conception. So just having the information and being able to advocate for yourself.
Yeah. And I do think yeah, just bringing more awareness to this is really important so that you can advocate. I mean, obviously, there's so many reasons why you might not be able or why you might be struggling to conceive. Like, it might have nothing to do with the thyroid. But I think at least checking on this is worth it because I even just know in my experience, we were talking about um like fertility medications like letrozole, those things that make you like hyper ovulate and things like that. Like we were having those kinds of discussions before we ever talked about the thyroid. So if you are someone that is struggling to conceive and your thyroid has not been checked, I would definitely recommend at least starting there and just seeing if that's something that needs to be addressed. And like you said, making sure you're advocating. Um, and yeah.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting like point that you brought up. And I think that a lot, if you're seeing, like a fertility specialist or even just your OBGYN because you're having difficulty conversations, a lot of them aren't asking questions about like what does your nutrition look like? What does your lifestyle look like? It, I've had previous clients that are coming and they're like, yeah, they were just like, try until like 6 months or 12 months and then come back and see us and we'll look at medication, options. And so, that part is just like not even part of the conversation, which is just so mind-boggling to me because so much of, the, on, what is that? Fertility issues that they don't see are related to like insulin resistance or, not ovulating properly, the thyroid, and a lot of these things, while sometimes, again, do need medications to be help managed, you can do through lifestyle and nutrition changes, and you can then conceive. And so, like, this should really be our starting point is looking here. And then if we're not making progress, we lean into these other treatments.
Yeah. And I think too, if you're not being heard, like if it feels like you're being dismissed when you bring up these things, like remembering that like you can go get another opinion, you can see a different doctor. There are so many wonderful OBs and midwives that do pay attention to this stuff. And so if you feel like you're yeah, just like not being taken seriously or not being heard, like go see someone else because you'll find someone who is like, oh, wait,
Yeah.
like even like my primary care doctor, who immediately was like, no, this is a problem. And I love my primary care doctor. She's so great about like paying attention to these things, trying to find the root cause, like not dismissing my symptoms. So like I always recommend like try to find a doctor who truly listens to you and wants what's best for you because they are out there. I know like right now we're in a
Yeah.
weird space, just like with people like being anti-doctors, but there's a lot of fantastic doctors. And so just keep looking for one.
Yes, 100%. Well, I think that's a good way to wrap up today's conversation. We really enjoy being able to, again, bring these topics to you that maybe aren't being talked about enough so that you can be aware of them. So if this was helpful, please leave a comment, share it with a friend. We really appreciate your support, and we will be back next week.